I wonder whether we could kick off, Neil, with an anecdote that I heard the other day, which I think you'll enjoy. I hope the audience will enjoy, and which I think may serve to open up a lot of issues that preoccupy us both. Here's the anecdote. A friend of mine was at a luncheon party being held in the Cotswolds, at which members of a network known as the Cotswolds, what are they called? The Cotswolds Network? Mafia or whatever, were present, including the ex-Prime Minister David Cameron. After lunch, Cameron was seen somewhat in his cups, sitting in a wing armchair and rather loudly bemoaning his fate, whereupon another attendee at this lunch party came up to the armchair he was sitting in, put his hands either side, put his face up to Cameron's and said, no children present, I hope.
Cover their ears.
Not even my fucking golf club changes its rules on a majority vote. So the question really is, why do you think that the Brexit vote, if you do think this, I don't want to put thoughts into your mind, why do you think that the Brexit referendum vote needs to be honoured above all other deliberations in our democracy at the moment? Or do you think that?
I don't think I do think that. It seems to me that, first of all, we slipped into the error of a majority-based referendum without quite thinking it through. And I look back on the 1970s Scottish devolution referendum, different rules. That rule would have been a much smarter rule to maintain in referendums. But by the time we got to proportional representation, a decision had been taken that that wasn't fair, and that the Scottish devolution referendum hadn't been fair. And I think we did not sufficiently explore the significance of that change. It very nearly brought the union between Scotland and England to an end, that rule. It was a close-run thing in 2014. And that should have warned everybody that having a referendum on British membership of the EU would be extremely risky. I certainly came to think in the course of the year running up to the referendum that it was going to be 50-50. At the beginning of that year, I thought it'll be fine. The status quo will be maintained. The status quo tends to survive referendums. The closer we got to it and the more time I spent in provincial Britain, because you had to get out of London, the more I realized it was going to be 50-50. And I think it's fair, of course, to question David Cameron's handling of the issue. But I don't think that was the fatal mistake. I think, or put it this way, the fatal mistake had already been made. It would be very hard to have the referendum on any other basis, because we'd done several on the majority basis. The big mistake, and I wrote about this in the Sunday Times today, was actually not to call Angela Merkel's bluff when she failed to cut him any slack at all on the fundamental issue of migration. And I think if he had simply said, and I think it was February of 2016, sorry, that's not acceptable, therefore I am going to recommend Brexit, then I think the Europeans would have folded. So that was his mistake. And when you next see him in the Cotswold Mafia, which I've no doubt you now belong to, Will, you must say that to him, because that was the mistake.
I'm only a member of a much lesser criminal network centered on the Chilterns, actually. But,
the Chiltern Camorra.
Yeah, and that wasn't a sort of, this happened to a friend of mine because it really happened to me. It really happened to a friend of mine. I assure you, had I been in a position to put my hands on either wing of Mr. Cameron's armchair, I don't think I'd have been quite so restrained, because it seems to me that I don't think a lot of thought went into it, either strategically or tactically, that this was a classic case of constitutional changes being dickered with in our polity on partisan grounds, just as the devolution votes were originally triggered by Blair's desire to shore up his own incumbency.
I think that, and I'm not going to be as harsh about David Cameron as you are, I think the decision to promise a referendum was indispensable to the election victory that David Cameron then won. I think if that pledge hadn't been made, UKIP would have become a far more dangerous force and more Tories would have defected. There would have been a kind of revolt in the shires of that form. So I can understand why he did it. I do remember thinking when he made that speech in which he committed to the referendum, oh dear, he didn't need to do that. It seemed to me that it was risky. But I came to realize why he'd done it and that it was an essential way of winning the election, and it worked. I mean, they won that majority, which is now easy to forget was rather a remarkable achievement. But it was a Pyrrhic victory, a classic Pyrrhic victory, because, and here's another mistake that I think was fatal, they decided to run the campaign against Brexit on economic grounds in the way that they had run the campaign against Scottish independence. Now, if you say to the Scotsman, look, this is really going to cost you quite a bit of money, the Scotsman naturally responds, oh, well, we're not doing it in that case. How many pennies did you say? And I think George Osborne, seeing how effective that had been in the Scottish referendum campaign, decided to play the same cards in the Brexit campaign. And the Treasury reports that were really the main ammunition on the Remain side were designed to explain to English and Welsh voters that it would be very expensive to leave the European Union. And in my experience, when I went to provincial Wales and provincial England talking about this, the general response in the pubs, for example, in South Wales was, fine, we'd be very happy to pay in order to address the issue that you, David Cameron, and you, George Osborne, aren't talking about, which is immigration. I'll tell you, you want an anecdote? We're here Sunday afternoon, let's have anecdotes. I was in a pub in a place called Porthcawl, and I was sitting next to the man who owns the biggest off-license in Bridgend. I'm moving all the right circles. This is my network. He said, you know, Neil, you know what my best-selling beers are? I said, no, Gareth, I don't know what your best-selling beers are these days. Do put me in the picture. He said, Polish and Lithuanian beer. I said, I infer from that fact that you must be a great supporter of the Remain campaign, as these are your biggest customers. He looked at me as if I'd lost my mind. He said, don't you see how much bloody money they're making here? And I said, after I'd had that conversation to George Osborne, we have a problem, because your economic argument doesn't matter to him. His best customers are Polish and Lithuanian workers, and he's going to vote for Brexit. That's the problem, because it's an issue it's about immigration, much more than it's about percentages of GDP. I think that was the other reason that it went the way it did.
So in your column today in the Sunday Times, you're giving Mutti a slap over...
I would never hit a woman, but I did write a kind of critique of her because I think she's massively overrated, massively. And I think it's time to recognize Merkel, Angela Merkel is known as Mutti, in case you're wondering, Angela Merkel's fairly disastrous track record on a whole range of issues, of which immigration is probably the most serious.
And that's the one you really focus in on, the letting in of the 1 million Syrian refugees. You point to increase in crime statistics of various sorts.
By the way, they weren't all Syrian refugees. Probably about half of the people who came into Germany when she opened the gates in late 2015 until now were refugees and half were not. And of the refugees only, about a third were from Syria. Just to be clear.
In your new book, and I want to obviously get on to discussing your new contribution really to historiography, to a shift in your own work, which I've followed over many years from a kind of narrative of history that's based to some extent on individual actors or actors in various constellations, this idea, and really no Marxist view, but it struck me that what you're proposing in the square and the tower is a kind of dialectical relationship between networks and hierarchies in terms of historical developments. And I do want to discuss that, so we'll park that thought. But I also very much wanted, and I felt that it would be, because there's not, you know, I mean, love isn't breaking out all over, but there isn't any personal antipathy between us, that it would be very useful and important, in fact, in front of an audience like this, to really drill down on this anxiety that I detect in your work. It's not even an anxiety, a kind of almost revulsion against what you see as the rising Islamic population of Europe. And although you are at pains throughout your journalism, your published history, to draw a distinction between Islamophobia and a robust critique, or kind of, it's really like your friend up in Bridgend. You do seem to have this idea that this is a unilaterally bad thing, more Muslim people coming into European society. And just hold there for a minute. And the other thing I sort of find very difficult to grasp about your thinking is, what are we who are living in Britain meant to do in respect of our fellow British Muslim citizens? How are we to comport ourselves in response to them, given that you seem to view them as a Trojan horse for the destruction of our civilization?
Well, what you've said will, in every conceivable way, misrepresents my position.
Great! Yes!
And egregiously.
Yes!
Number one, I am not in any way prejudiced against Muslims. My wife is a former Muslim. And
well, former could be the operative word there. I mean, for example...
Let me continue.
Yeah.
There is no respect in which I have ever evinced prejudice, racial or religious prejudice, because I was brought up to believe in freedom of religion, free speech, free thought, free worship. Racial equality was drilled into me by my mother and father.
On the basis into me now.
I'm going to drill it into you. I'm going to drill it into you, Will, because I will not be accused implicitly or explicitly of racial or religious prejudice. That is anathema to me and my family, and it always has been.
Okay.
Just to be clear. So it's not about that.
Okay.
It's not about that. The issue is not immigrants. I'm an immigrant. I don't agree with the man in the pub in Wales. It's absurd to be worried about immigration per se, regardless of where people come from. It doesn't matter, fundamentally, whether they're from Lithuania or Libya. That's not the issue. The two things that we need to get clear here. Number one, history shows that any really large increase in immigration, a big surge, a change in the rate of migration, nearly always has unintended consequences. Because not everybody has drilled into them the values that my mother and father gave me. And so it was entirely predictable that if really large-scale increases in migration occurred, as they did to the United States in the last 30 years, to Europe in the last 20, that there would be a political backlash. And it was a foolish mistake of members of the political elite and the intellectual and academic elite to pretend that that was not going to happen and to talk as if there were only economic benefits to immigration and anybody who raised any other issues must be a bigot. Secondly, there's a problem with Islam, not Muslims, Islam, a problem that dates back to radicalization, if you want to call it that, an increasing fundamentalism from the 1970s in both Sunni and Shia in Islam. The radicalization of Islam in our time is one of the great phenomena of modern history. It's completely against the trend that you would have expected if you thought that Islam was going to behave like Christianity. Secularization didn't show up in the Muslim world, the opposite showed up. A deep resacralization and an increasing literalism in the interpretation of the Holy Scriptures. Because Islam has a problem, and I'm here only quoting my wife, who's been writing and talking about this since 9/11, we can't simply assume that the jihadist network will go away when it is manifestly growing in most parts of the Muslim world. If there is large-scale migration from Muslim countries, whether it's to Europe or to North America, it is highly likely that the network of dawah, which is extreme ideology, and jihad, which is violent extremism, will grow. And it is growing. The principal cause of terrorist violence in the world today, responsible for between 80 and 90% of terrorist deaths every year, is radical Islam. Worldwide, wherever you look. So, are we simply going to pretend that's not the case? Are we just going to tell ourselves it's all going to be fine and repeat nonsensical platitudes such as Islam is a religion of peace, and anybody who discusses the Islam problem is an Islamophobe? I am not an Islamophobe. I'm not a Muslimophobe any more than my wife is. But we are clearly concerned by the growth of organizations like Islamic State, the obvious penetration of West European countries, including the UK, by that organization, and the failure, over 20 years, the failure of counter-radicalization initiatives, which have nearly all run into the sand. So that's the answer to your question. I'm not appalled by immigrants. I'm appalled by the spread of jihadism. And I have a reasonable ground to be appalled by that when I'm married to a woman who is threatened with death by these people. I mean, that seems to me to be a pretty good reason to be worried. You cannot leave Islam. Apostasy is punishable by death. Look at the Pew report of a couple of years ago, in which they polled people in Muslim-majority countries, asking them the question, do you think the punishment for apostasy should be death? Very large majorities in Iraq, in Pakistan, in most Muslim-majority countries they polled, said yes. Now, let me add one final point, because this is such a fundamental issue. If we had a coherent strategy to integrate newcomers into our economy, into our society, into our culture, there would be much less cause for concern. But what makes the German problem particularly concerning, it's much worse than the British problem. British economy is quite good at integrating immigrants. Not as good as the US economy, but pretty good. The North European economies on the continent are very bad at it. The unemployment rate for non-native born people in places like Germany, Sweden is more than twice that of the native born population. So they don't integrate well economically. They don't integrate well culturally. I know that. I've lived in Germany. I've seen the extent to which even the Turkish communities, which date back several generations now, remain fundamentally not well integrated into major German cities. And I think at this point, having run this extraordinarily reckless experiment of essentially admitting around 1 million people and showing little sign of expelling those whose asylum applications are rejected, the Germans are taking a huge risk. And the rest of us should be much more concerned about it than we are.
Do you not think that the politicization, the move towards more fundamentalist interpretations of the Quran that you identify in the 1970s, do you think you're right to equate that with Islam qua Islam? Because you say the implication there is that Islam is unique of the monotheisms in having this tendency towards violence.
Well, no, I don't say that because it'd be easy to say that in the 17th century Christianity was very violent. But what's very clear is that Islam...
So what I'm saying is,
well, let me finish.
Islam is not just...
Islam is different from Christianity and Judaism. It is not just a religion. Islam is also a political ideology because the Prophet Muhammad did not recognize the separation of mosque and state. The point about Sharia is a code for living.
Well,
it is not just a religious
ultramontanism present in Christianity as well as an idea.
But where are we now in the 21st century? Christian communities...
I think it's the Austrian constitution that says supreme authority will be vested in God.
But in practice, the separation of church and state in this country, in most European countries, is a firmly established reality. And secularization of Christian communities is extremely far advanced.
Yeah, but what I'm saying
the situation in Islam is different, partly because Islam is a newer religion historically. Perhaps it will take it'll just take a few more centuries for these things to happen to Islam. But it is designed differently, Will. It's fundamentally designed differently. It's designed differently because it does not recognize this separation between the secular and the temporal that is fundamental to Christianity.
So
read the New Testament. Render unto Caesar.
Saying, Neil,
Muhammad never says render unto Caesar.
Are you saying, Neil, that every British Muslim is a time bomb
no,
of political waiting to go off?
That is the kind of language which is irresponsible on your part. Of course not. In fact, only a minority, it's clear, a minority of Muslims are drawn into radical organizations. And so no, it's not every Muslim. That's absurd. The issue is that the network is extremely effective at selecting vulnerable people in communities all around the world, in Muslim communities, in Muslim countries as well as in Western countries, and drawing them into an incredibly destructive ideology, which I think is profoundly dangerous and is certain on present trends to grow.
Well, there's a paradox, though, isn't there? Because, I mean, you talk about I draw you back to this thing. I teach in a British university that has the highest proportion of people from British Asian and African Caribbean and British African communities. We're 65% ethnic minority. I often find myself in classes with young women in hijabs sitting in front of me while I'm teaching. What should my attitude be towards these young hijab-wearing women or young men with beards that are obviously influenced by some kind of, if not jihadist, militant Islamic tendency? How should I respond to these people as a pedagogue? I'm a leader of young men and women. How should I respond to them in the classroom?
I've been teaching a lot longer than you will, and I've taught in some extremely ethnically diverse student communities. Harvard and at Stanford. At Stanford, only around a third of the student body identifies as white. There are substantial, there's extraordinary ethnic diversity in most American colleges now. It's mandated. It's something that their admissions policies pursue. And the answer to your question is very simple. You should teach them exactly in the same way as you teach every student.
So our values lie in our openness as teachers, not in
I'm simply channeling Ayan here, because this is really a fight that she has fought and an argument that she has made much more eloquently than me, but I feel obliged to do it. All she has ever argued for is that Muslims, like Christians, like anybody in your classroom, should be allowed to engage in critical thinking about everything, including their faith. In just the way that Christians are able to think critically, or Jews are able to think critically about their faith. And if at the end of their semester with you, Will, they decide, you know what, maybe I should be an atheist like Will Self, they should be able to be. That's all. That's what a free society means. And if the response is no, that's not allowed, Muslims are not able to have that conversation. And if you start to raise questions about, I don't know, the eternal verity of the Quran, there'll be trouble. If that's the reality, then we have a problem. But if you should treat them exactly the way that you treat any student, and they should be able to engage with your often blasphemous and pornographic books just as much as with my altogether less salacious literature.
I'm not an atheist. Perhaps that's why I'm a little bit more tolerant than you.
Well, again, in what respect am I intolerant? What have I said that's intolerant?
Because like a lot of atheists, since you believe in an article of faith, as an article of faith in the truth of this statement, then you judge everybody according to this truth.
Actually, I'm the least dogmatic atheist you'll ever meet. I was brought up an atheist. I never made a decision about that. I go to church. I'd quite like to have religious faith. It'd be nice. It's not something that's likely to happen. But it seems to me that to infer from that intolerance is bizarre. I'm a devotee of the fundamental Enlightenment skepticism of late 18th century Scotland. And that skepticism, I think, should be applied to every faith. We should be as skeptical about, as Voltaire was skeptical about Christianity, about Islam. We should be as skeptical about any faith. We should be skeptical about atheism. I'm skeptical about atheism because how can you possibly know?
Yes.
So you're not going to get me on that. I'm not Christopher Hitchens. I'm absolutely the most doubting of atheists. All that seems to me to be required is perhaps a Muslim enlightenment is the right way of putting it. Ayan called it an Islamic Reformation in her last book. A transformation is clearly necessary if this religion is to coexist peacefully with the rest of the world in the 21st century. And I think that's possible. By the way, and it doesn't get nearly enough attention, an increasing number of Muslims are thinking critically, are challenging the clerics with their intolerant messages of anti-Semitism and hostility to the infidel. It's happening. I'm far more optimistic about that than I was 10 years ago. And I think that there is a growing network of skeptical Muslims. Majid Nawaz in this town is one of them. And what is fascinating is that they are going ahead with their free thinking, even in the face of death threats from the jihadists. And I salute their courage, because that's not a risk I have to take. I'm not an apostate. Nobody comes after me saying, I'm going to kill you because you stopped being a Presbyterian. There's a big difference.
You say, I think in the new book, you say that the government's prevent strategy hasn't gone far enough, but the government's prevent strategy is in direct contravention of ideas of intellectual and academic freedom in the context of the university. As a British academic, I'm now asked to monitor my students' behavior in a way that seems to me absolutely incompatible with the Enlightenment values that you promulgate.
It's a free society, Will. You don't need to do anything.
Well, I have to conform to the university's prevent strategy in order to teach there. Well, so you cannot be a teacher at a British university unless you act as an agent of the state in surveying your own students.
Oh, I think you should resign.
So in other words, you think the prevent strategy's gone too far?
It's clearly gone too far for you. I happen to think that if there were clear evidence of jihadist penetration of the student body that I was working with, I would want something to be done about it.
So you think it's acceptable within a university if a student is a member of a Muslim organization in the university to monitor their computer traffic, for example? That is immediately acceptable?
No, of course not.
But that's mandated under the prevent strategy at the moment.
The issue is whether groups like Islamic State are managing to penetrate Muslim communities, including student communities, because young people are especially vulnerable. That's the issue. What are you going to do otherwise? How are you actually going to prevent this network growing? Or perhaps you think it's not growing. Perhaps you think that we can simply live with the growing, or perhaps you think not growing, network of dawah and jihad. If you think that, then fine. And I hope that nobody ever blows up you or a member of your family.
Well, that's just tendentious argument, and it's beneath you, sir.
Well, I don't see what's tendentious about it. Or maybe you think the tens of thousands of people who are killed every year by these groups simply are a rounding error.
Where you and I differ is that you seem to feel that this is innate in a religious ideology and has
I don't think it's innate at all. I just said to you that it's perfectly plausible Islam will achieve an enlightenment or a reformation. That's to
but
be
in your
hoped
book
for,
you say
and I
things
think
like
it's-
that.
and I
No,
think it's
you
happening.
do argue tendentiously. In your book you say Islamic State is a true portrayal of Islam.
I haven't written
That's
that.
what you say.
I haven't written that at all. What I've done is to
Well, I mean,
quote.
I pull the quote up if you like.
Well, actually, the quotation is from Graham Wood. And it's Graham Wood, not me, who wrote that.
That's right, yeah. You're
yes.
quoting somebody else, but approvingly.
Graham Wood's article in The Atlantic,
Approvingly.
I merely quoted in order that you recognize the literalism of Islamic State, which which he wrote about on the basis of first-hand observation in Iraq and Syria, it's an important thing. You can't kid yourself.
Well, we don't.
They say constantly what we are doing is in line with the word of the Prophet. You look at their texts. You can say, oh, they're quoting out of context. Yeah, selective quotation is exactly what they do, but that's what they say. They say they're doing that. And it's not surprising if people are drawn to that message when they feel dissatisfied, frustrated with the compromises of Western society.
This is reasoning. This is a dialelos. This is circular reasoning. You're just moving from your premises back to your conclusion in a circle.
What exactly are you saying? What are you saying, Will? That there's no problem?
No,
because if you're saying that, I think you're delusional.
I think there is a problem, but I don't think it's by any means the worst problem we currently face.
Well, I don't think it is either, but it's the one that you started talking about.
The other thing is...
When you accused me of being a bigot.
Shall
we talk about more important things?
Well, just to finish off on this, because you also are very... want to point out that the errors in the Middle East, and particularly, I, in common with many of the kind of liberal elite, as you style them, who you're most opposed to.
I was forgetting that you were a man of the proletariat, Will, with your Oxford education.
Liberal elite. Weird. Weird guy. Okay.
What's weird about my saying that you're a member of the elite?
Nothing at all. I just thought we were going to have a sort of non-ad hominem afternoon.
We would have done if you hadn't started to misrepresent my position on
Well, that's not really being ad hominem. That's just an error of fact. Tonight you had the opportunity to correct yourself. Perhaps you can do the same over this. I mean, I would see, and I think a lot of people in this hall would see a lot of the problems as resulting from the post-9/11 aim to bring democracy to regimes in the Middle East through the barrel of the gun. But you seem to not regard the millions of displaced people in the Middle East, the 3 failed states and rising, as being productive, as being the pump primer to Islamism. You seem to want to locate it intrinsically in the faith, and I think that that's a mistake. I think we should be much more pragmatic about this, and we should face up to what a disaster the post-9/11 interventions have been. But,
just a second.
Rather wanting you to answer that directly, it might be more interesting to say where we differ is that and I'm somewhat puzzled, having read your new book, as to what it is you want. Do you want to return? Because in your comments on post-9/11 politics in the Middle East, what you seem to abhor a lot in the world, and this goes right back in your work, is a power vacuum. Nature abhors this power vacuum. And you feel, for example, that Obama should have maintained troop presences in Iraq. I mean, you wrote a whole book saying that America wasn't taking the responsibilities of its quasi-empire seriously. So do you think it's just been a lack of force that has ended us up with these failed states and these millions of pseudo-refugees in Europe? I mean, is there a loss of nerve?
Let's get a couple of things straight. 9/11 didn't cause Al-Qaeda.
No,
Al-Qaeda caused 9/11. Let's not confuse the chronology. The extremist wave in Islam long predated the invasion of Iraq. So that's number one. And so
indeed. I mean,
yes.
Clearly what most aided Al-Qaeda was the CIA's funding of the Mujahideen in the Afghanistan conflict.
Which I write about in my book Colossus, which perhaps you've read or perhaps you just read the Guardian review. The book said, and it was published, written just about the time that the decision to invade Iraq was taken, published more or less as it was happening. Number one, this is going to go wrong. And the argument of the book was, it is highly unlikely that the United States will make a success of its interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan because of three deficits. A manpower deficit, because Americans really don't want to spend more than 6 months on any given tour of duty in those places. A fiscal deficit, because the US is simply not fiscally capable of sustaining an imperial enterprise. And an attention deficit, because American voters will lose interest in this whole thing in about 4 years. And that was completely accurate, completely correct. And so the idea that I was a cheerleader for the invasion of Iraq is a complete misrepresentation. I was deeply critical of the neoconservatives at that time, and I said, this will fail. That was why the subtitle of the book was The Price of America's Empire, or in the UK, The Rise and Fall of America's Empire. So I wish we could just for once finally lay to rest this cliche, which is entirely wrong, that I was in favor of this operation.
That.
I was highly skeptical
about it. I never said that.
I
said you seem to be in favor of maintaining troop presences
so the argument
in Iraq.
I made, once they had done it, with all the consequences that were predictable, to pull out as hastily as Obama did was very likely to lead to a return to that chaos that we'd seen at the time of Fallujah. And that is exactly what happened. Iraq was, in fact, pretty stable after the Petraeus surge, and Obama's decision to pull all the US troops out and simply hand it over to Maliki was a disaster. And that again, you know, I wish we could all go back to, I don't know, the 1920s and do this differently. But we're here. It's 100 years since Sykes-Picot, more than 100 now. We can't endlessly argue about whose fault it is that people are engaged in brutal acts of violence in Syria, in Iraq. The issue is, how can we stop this? How can we stop this? And we failed. Not only did the Bush administration make a mess in Iraq, the Obama administration allowed Iraq to descend back into anarchy, and then allowed Syria to descend into an even worse anarchy. How that can be regarded as a success is beyond my comprehension. And yet European politicians, including, it should be said, Angela Merkel, essentially offered no answer other than to criticize the United States. And here we are, with the massive refugee crisis, which isn't over. The flows out of North Africa and the Middle East are ongoing. The routes are less easy than they were in 2015-16, but people are still traveling. And more people are joining them, coming from further south in Africa. This is a grave state of affairs. The prospects are extremely troubling. And you say, what do I want? Well, what I want is for people in North Africa and the Middle East to have the kind of life quality that we have, the ability to sit in a hall like this and have the discussion we've had without fear that somebody's going to blow the place up, which is the fear that you have in a crowded room in the Middle East or North Africa today. What we need to ask is, how on earth can the rich countries of the world help to stabilize these countries?
Well, you like counterfactual history. What do you think would have happened if coalition forces hadn't gone into Iraq in 2003?
I've often thought about that. Indeed, I made the argument that if you didn't do that, if you simply left Saddam in power, that there would be a crisis sooner or later, but not as severe a crisis as the one precipitated by his overthrow. Because clearly it wasn't a stable state of affairs. We had no certainty about what his plans were, but Saddam Hussein was not a nice man, and certainly the Middle East was not in a stable state in 2002. But I think it's clear that as I argued at the time, the United States was taking on something that was beyond its power in trying to transform Afghanistan and Iraq into democracies.
Well, it's relevant to this polity as well. We had a military involvement that ended with us losing, in fact, having to withdraw from Basra under the actual guns of the Mahdi army.
And I said at the time, Will, in an article in 2002, that the United Kingdom should not participate. I strongly had urged Britain not to become involved in the invasion of Iraq. I said it would be a tremendous mistake because it was not clear to me at all why it was in Britain's national interest to support so uncritically the American initiative.
So some shame, surely, on the part of people in the British and American governmental elites who were involved in those decisions. Actual kind of shame might be called.
I mean, shame isn't a particularly constructive emotion. There's plenty of it. I mean, lots of people have spent the last 10 years beating themselves up for the decisions that they took. I have friends who've completely transformed their own political position on the basis that they think they made mistakes. So I think there's been plenty of self-criticism, and you don't hear terribly much these days from the more strident neoconservatives who argued that it would be easy. But I think the issue that is really worth discussing is, well, what can we do? Because at the moment there is no coherent plan in view. And that seems to me, from a European vantage point, you're all geographically much closer to this than I am because I live in California. There really needs to be a great deal more than what we currently have, which is a rather feeble discussion along the lines of, if we can only get more aid to these places, perhaps they'll stop coming. And Macron seems to me to be thinking somewhat more creatively about these problems, but that's partly because, like most French leaders of the last half century, he has a somewhat colonial view of West Africa. But I don't think we have yet satisfactorily answered the question, what is the responsibility of rich countries when poorer countries descend into anarchy? Whether we caused it or not, what do we do? We have singularly failed to solve the problems of poverty and misrule through aid. The great effort of the second half of the 20th century to solve the problems of failed or failing states through various forms of aid. I mean, these things have been far less successful. Indeed, it's very striking when one makes this comparison, far less successful than what the Chinese are currently doing through their One Belt, One Road initiative, which is just to build lots of infrastructure that previously wasn't there. And I fear that gradually the initiative is slipping away from the Western world to China, because the Chinese approach is, and they abhor anarchy even more than I do, the Chinese approach is, well, if we can build an electricity grid, if we can build a rail network and a road network, and if we can stabilize the security forces, then what's not to like? And at this point, that's the way the world is going. We drifted very far from the central thesis of the book, but one of the central arguments of The Square and the Tower is that the Chinese have a vision of the 21st century, which, number one, is coherent with respect to economic development, and number two is coherent with respect to political development. And that development is not in the direction of democracy. What is today's news? Xi Jinping just became the permanent leader of China. The Chinese understand very well the problems of economic development and social control. And that's the thing that I find almost absent from discussion in Europe. There's no recognition of the extent to which the global geopolitical terms of trade are turning against this part of the world and in favor of a new and fundamentally undemocratic power. If you think you have trouble doing your job as an academic in the UK, you talk to some of my Chinese colleagues.
And that's progress for you. I mean, it's not a question of North European exceptionalism. It's not, you're not being Panglossian about the rise of Europe. In The Square and the Tower, you do think that there is something, there's some kind of genius loci in this part of the world that is majorly responsible for a kind of step change in human development, and you want to see that projected into the future.
What the book Civilization argues is that, rather by chance, a series of ideas and institutions began in northwestern Europe that work everywhere, but they began here. It was here, actually, right in this part of the world, that the idea of competition, economic and political competition with autonomous corporations that weren't directly under imperial rule, that idea took hold. And it was in this part of the world that the scientific revolution happened, which fundamentally changed our relationship to the natural world. It was here in northwestern Europe that the rule of law based on private property rights evolved. But I never argued that that was anything.
I think
but let me finish, because it's an important point. You subtly implied that I thought this was the result of some superior quality of northwestern Europe. No, it's random. And one of the key points of civilization is that when these ideas and institutions were copied in other parts of the world, beginning with Japan in the Meiji era, they worked there too. At the end of civilization says, here comes China, which is going to download 4 out of the 6 killer apps of Western civilization, and we don't know whether that can work. Because the Chinese are basically downloading 4. They're not going to download the rule of law based on private property, and they're not going to download the idea of political competition. But everything else, modern medicine, the scientific revolution, they're there, done. Competition, consumerism, the work ethic, that has all essentially been replicated from Western models, and that is where we are. I have argued throughout my work, for those who bother to read it, that there are ideas and institutions that are universally applicable. 100 years ago, people thought that people from northwestern Europe and the places where they had settled were richer because there was some racial superiority or cultural superiority. And I've always said in my work, that's wrong. That's not the case. It was actually sheer dumb luck that economic and political competition took root in places like England. And it was partly because the crown, the monarchy, was so weak in this country. I mean,
but if it's sheer dumb...
there's nothing, there's no kind of superiority in that. If anything, it was the inferiority of English monarchy that made a more representative system of government possible.
I may not have read all of your work. You are a very prolific historian.
Well, I've read all of yours.
All of it?
Well, not the journalism.
You have read all of my 23 published books?
Not all of them.
No. Thank you for that.
Nearly all.
What they've done, it's like a sort of weird inverted pissing contest. So you can, but you are very keen on...
I didn't read the one about apes.
Right.
Because I'd seen the movie.
You yet to be a major motion picture, I'm afraid.
That wasn't you? Planet of the Apes wasn't you?
You are a narrative historian, in a
Sometimes.
sense, sometimes. You've written a book on historical counterfactuals. You certainly, I think, and you're going to say I'm horribly misrepresenting you, but that seems to be par for the course at the moment.
There is a pattern.
If so, I'm sorry. But it seems to me you do... A lot of your work has been perhaps a necessary kickback against Marxist historians, against historians who place human development within a matrix of pressures over which the individual has very little control. We think of Marx, history is made by the great mass of individuals. In contradistinction to this, you've tended to place, what we might call great individuals. You have an example in the current book of Napoleon's indefatigability as a worker, putting him as a very powerful node in a hierarchical kind of network as opposed to a distributed network. You did the counterfactual histories. They all seem to have at their center an idea of what human agency is, what human free will is. And yet I sense that's not very philosophically well-grounded on your part. For example, why are you so preoccupied by historical counterfactuals? Do you think that the displaying of contingency in human affairs somehow allows you wiggle room for human free will? If so, you're sadly deluded.
I wonder what the Arsenal score is.
I think that's a bit of a cheap way out of a debating point, Neil, is to try and pretend in true English fashion to become a Philistine at the point at which you need to raise your game, sir. Start talking about games. Remember what Montaigne said. Mistrust a man who takes games too seriously.
I think
means
games
he doesn't take life seriously enough.
I think games are very serious because we learn from games, because I don't know the score, that the future is uncertain. And there is, in fact, no way of predicting whether Arsenal will defeat Manchester City or not. And that is the state we are in at any given time with respect to the future, and it relates to all the issues that confront us. I don't know if Angela Merkel, a week from now, will still be the German Chancellor. She might not be if the German Social Democrat Party members vote not to go into the Great Coalition. I don't know whether Donald Trump will be re-elected for a second term as president, but you can't rule that out either, no matter how much you despise him. The true nature of the historical process is that it's uncertain, and all attempts by philosophers of history, including Marx, to create some structure that makes the historical process simple and predictable are doomed to failure, because history is too complex to model. Marx's model was a very crude one, anyway, borrowed from Hegel and Ricardo, a sort of strange mix of political economy and German idealism. And it doesn't work. I actually have a lot of sympathy with Marx, and I was joking the other day that I'm a Marxist in some ways. I'm just on the side of the bourgeoisie. But in the end, when you try to understand in any serious way historical change, you realize how unhelpful Marxist categories were. People don't, in fact, belong to mass classes, whether you think there are 2 or 3 of these classes. That's not ever how it looks when you get up close and do serious historical research, which is the central part of what I do. So the reason that I'm interested in counterfactuals is that we cannot know. And most history is written, it seems to me, without sufficient respect for the ignorance of contemporaries about the future. Most historians are drawn into some form of teleology or other, whether it's Marxist or not. I mean, a lot of the historians who were writing when I was undergraduate...
I certainly see it in your work, teleology.
Well, I'm very averse to it, because constantly I remind people that there are multiple futures at any given point. That was why I wrote Virtual History. It was why in The Pity of War I argued that there was a choice, that Britain didn't need to intervene in 1914, and that there might actually have been an argument, and a very good argument, on the left, by the way, to stay out of that disastrous war. There was a choice in 1938. Britain didn't need to appease Hitler. Hitler was in a weak position in 1938. Churchill was right. Chamberlain was wrong. And so on. So almost all my work is designed to say to people, there were alternative paths. And often it was sheer chance that sent history in the direction it took.
Right, so
even the rise of the West is not that strongly determined. And it could indeed have been terminated if the Ottoman Empire had been better managed in the vital 16th and 17th century period, when the Ottoman Empire could really have destroyed what was happening in northwestern Europe. It got quite close to doing that with 2 sieges of Vienna. So I don't accept that there's teleology in my work. On the contrary, I think I try my best to give you, the reader, a sense of what it was like then not to know what was going to happen, not to know what the future would be like. As soon as you do serious historical research and read the letters and diaries of people who lived the history, you realize they didn't know. The Jesus College betting book, which I remember discovering one evening, is full of bets about what will happen in World War II, made by the Fellows of Jesus as the war unfolded. They didn't know that it would end in 1945 with an Allied victory. They had no certainty that Hitler would attack the Soviet Union and change the entire course of the war. That's what most history books are bad at, because historians are drawn into certain narrative fallacies. They want to tell a story that makes sense. And often historians are drawn towards the rules and regulations of literature. They want historical actors to be like characters in novels who have a kind of consistency, not your novels, admittedly, but in traditional novels. They want literary form to be there to make history intelligible. But the terrible truth about history is it's a total mess. It's a total chaotic shambles. And what the historian has to do is somehow to extract from this shambles a shape that is intelligible. but always to show the reader that the historical actors have great uncertainty. They labor under massive uncertainty. The only people who don't are the people who believe in some teleological ideology, whether it's Marxism or Islamism, the people who think history is on their side. And they still exist today. If anybody ever says to you in there, or you hear them say in a speech, the arc of history is bending my way, run. It's a terrible sign. There is no arc of history.
Have you finished?
Yes.
Forever.
I'm quite happy to go and watch the football if you've had enough.
So what I wanted to probe here, okay, I accept your argument that you're non-teleological in that sense. You don't see a purpose lying beneath all this, but you didn't really answer the question. What do you think the capacity of individual humans really is in terms of their free will?
Well,
where do you locate it?
It's a silly debate, because the real issue is...
It's not a silly debate.
Tolstoy shows it's a silly debate in War and Peace. The truth is that we have some agency, but we're constrained. That's boring. The interesting thing is that if one thinks of people as nodes in networks, which is much more illuminating than members of the proletariat, if you think about all the people in this room...
No, wait a minute.
No, let me finish.
Neil,
let me finish.
Why? You've been going on at great length.
Well, you asked me to raise my game and give you a good answer.
I would say in terms of speech time, Professor Ferguson, in the last half hour, you've dominated by about 70% to 30. Wouldn't you agree?
A bit like Scotland, England yesterday.
So
it's all about possession,
your constant little bleats about, will you let me finish, as if I'm hogging the time, are absolutely ridiculous.
No, well, it's just that you're being annoying. You're really being annoying.
Well, I'm being annoying because I'm calling you to account in perhaps ways that you hadn't envisaged.
Well, if you want me to be accountable, let me speak.
You start to answer my question.
I don't know. Do you want me to answer your questions? Or
yeah,
just want to keep going?
You start to answer my question and, in fact, dismiss it in the first half clause. You say, Tolstoy said, we're constrained in some ways and we're free. That's boring. No, Neil, it's not boring.
It is boring.
That's the absolute gravamen of what you're meant to be doing as a historian. Is disentangling the extent to which individuals are constrained and the extent to which they can act. That's not boring, that's your job. Not bothering about the fucking football score.
So, as I was trying to explain, the argument in the Square and the Tower is that you can't understand anybody on their own in isolation, because no man is an island, or hardly any people are completely disconnected. Most of us are connected to one of many networks. And that connectedness is the analytically powerful tool that historians, until very recently, did not use. We did not, as historians, think at all about networks in a rigorous way. If we could graph the network of the people in this room, because each of you is a node, including the chief node here, each of you is connected to others in the room. We could graph the network. We could find out quite a lot about the network of people who come to these events with information. Probably we could get it from Mark Zuckerberg if we asked nicely. And that would be the way to think about why this event happened, why it came into existence, and what its purpose was, if indeed it has any purpose. So the key argument I'm trying to make in my recent work is that the individual, it's not the individual versus great historical forces. That's the boring thing that Tolstoy talks about at the end of War and Peace, and which people have been writing boring essays about for any number of years. The interesting thing is that the individual is always connected to multiple networks, usually. And it's those networks that have powerful explanatory force. And we can understand the structure of networks by analyzing them. We can look at how distributed, decentralized they are. We can find out which people in this room are the most connected. Obviously, Will, with his Cotswold and, what was the other one? Chiltern Mafia, has a network. But is he the best connected person in the room, or is it John Gordon who introduced the event, or is it somebody else? Maybe there's somebody in this room listening who's better connected than all of us. Maybe George Soros is sitting near the back. So we can, I think, use these new, and they are quite new tools, to understand how the individual operates in the context of the multiple networks to which he or she belongs. That's interesting.
Yeah, and it's an interesting book, but like any historian, you must be, in some sense, advocating how we should act, even given the contingencies that face us. You know, you are known as a conservative historian. I think that's not a tendentious thing to say, or, you know, so you have a message for how people should behave in terms of their actions within polities, within other kinds of economic networks, in terms of you have ideological preferences. History has a purpose, even if your history has a purpose, even if history doesn't have a purpose. So what is the message of the square and the tower?
Well, I'm not sure that it is the historian's role to say, this is how you should live.
Well, then give up your very lucrative column in the Sunday Times.
It's not lucrative at all. It's really the least lucrative thing I do.
Well, I always found sucking on Mr. Murdoch's tailpipe was really lucrative.
That's just an offensive thing to say.
I've done it myself, Neil.
It's an offensive thing to say to yourself. The public sphere is the public sphere. I mean, one comments on what happens, and I try to show that I think history has a way of illuminating our contemporary problems. I think of myself as not as a conservative historian. I've never been a member of the Conservative Party. I'm not a member of the Republican Party. I've been called a conservative any number of times, but I'm really just a classical liberal. As I said, my roots are in the Enlightenment, in classical liberalism. But I'm an applied historian. I think politics is not really something that you bring into history. As far as possible, you should leave it. Max Weber said this about lecturing. I think it's true about historical scholarship. Put the politics aside. May I just add, I think the key thing is to apply history, to try to learn from history what we can do about today. That's what I'm really about. I was repeatedly told when I was an undergraduate that we could learn nothing from history. This was a recurrent feature of the Oxford History faculty back in the 1980s. Oh no, how vulgar. Only journalists do that. We're far too grand to learn from history. What a kind of petty bourgeois thing to want to do. And I remember thinking, what bloody hell, what am I doing here if we're not trying to learn from history? What's the point? No, we are trying to learn from history. There's nothing else to go on. You can't solve any of the problems that you've raised. You know, what should we do about Islamic terrorism? What should we do about the breakdown of states in North Africa and the Middle East? There's no other way of answering these questions than by referring to history and trying to understand what it is that makes states fail, or what it is that causes a violent ideology suddenly to go viral. In the book, I try to show that we have some really good work still to do on why the ideas of Lenin went viral in the Russian Empire in 1917-18, why the ideas of Adolf Hitler went viral in Germany between around 1928 and 33. We don't really know. Nobody's really done the work on the Nazi network or the Bolshevik network. That research doesn't exist because for generations, historians, I think, wasted time on non-questions like, was the key to Hitler's rise the petty bourgeoisie or the bourgeoisie or the haute bourgeoisie? I mean, that was such a silly debate.
Well, the main, as I understand it, the main arguments in the historiography of the Nazi era have been between kind of Daniel Goldhagen and kind of German exceptionalism and Christopher Browning, ordinary men, and the idea that, no, this could happen anywhere. But maybe you regard that as a bit of a sideshow.
But that debate's is now 20 years old. The issue, to me, the really surprising thing is, despite the fact that there's good work being done on social networks in other fields, like 18th century intellectual history, nobody's actually bothered to analyze the Nazi party or the Nazi vote in terms of a network. Nobody's really tried to track why it was that Hitler's ideas went viral when they did. And yet we could do that, and I hope to do that in the next year or so. That's a really interesting question, because if we can understand better why toxic ideas go viral and suddenly become believed by millions of people, then I think we start to have a handle on what we can do about this very toxic version of Islam, which is being used to justify violence. That's the kind of thing that interests me.
it's a bit of a doorknob remark, as if one were leaving a therapist's, but it might open up the debate if we've got a bit of time for questions from the floor. I mean, what struck me, I enjoyed reading your book very much. I've enjoyed reading all of the stuff of yours that I've read. You write in a very engaging and accessible way.
Unlike you.
Unlike me, because...
I mean, I think James Joyce had a bad effect on you, Will. That's the conclusion I came to as I read my way through.
Do you love Joyce?
I hate Joyce.
No,
I hated Ulysses, and Finnegan's Wake is impossible.
How about Dubliners? Do you like that?
Flann O'Brien was the more interesting and funnier
You don't
Irish
like The
writer.
Dead by James Joyce? You don't like
No,
that story?
Joyce is overrated.
Really, Joyce
Almost
is
as overrated as Angela Merkel.
Well, it's good to see you here coming to us from your northern fastness, but you really belong here in London, Niall, because this is the native land of the Philistine, and you're proving to be a monumental one.
If hating Joyce makes me a Philistine, then I'm a Philistine. If imitating Joyce makes you a good writer, then I'm a bloody teapot.
You're a fascinating man. In the book, you say very little about climate change, but I assume that you do believe in the International Panel on Climate Change's predictions on the rises in global temperatures by the middle of this century.
Believe in them as an article of religious faith.
No, not as an article of religious faith, but you believe that global warming is anthropic and will continue.
Yeah, I think there's a pretty high probability of that.
Right. And the other really big statement you make in the book is that you view the complex of technologies, which I tend to call bidirectional digital media, and I think we at least agree on that the significant part about them is their bidirectionality.
There is one thing that we agree on.
Yeah, is their bidirectionality. But you don't view them as being fundamentally different to any other technologies, networking technologies of the past. I mean,
not really.
In other words, you don't think they're a major game changer in terms of what's likely to happen in the world?
Oh, they're a game changer. I mean, but only in terms of their scale and speed. Fundamentally, what the internet and the personal computer have done is not different from what the printing press did, in the sense that it's transformed the public sphere, and as in the 16th century, we are tremendously naive in our thinking about what will happen when we all become, or have become, far more connected. The key argument of the book is that we've gravely underestimated the downside of this hyper-connected world, in just the same way that Luther underestimated the downside risk of a religious reformation based on the printed word. But I don't think it's qualitatively different. It's quantitatively different, but the printing press was quantitatively different from the written book. It was not qualitatively different.
Okay, I think I've had enough. Should we open it up for questions? Has anybody got any questions? Perhaps you could wait for the microphone to arrive.
I think you have to choose.
No, I
you have free will. You have to choose.
Thank you for your time, guys. I just wanted to ask a question about a term that Professor Scott Galloway references called the Four Horsemen. So that is Google, Facebook, Apple, and Amazon. I just wanted to get your two opinions on the influence of these massive companies that have massive amounts of capital, massive amounts of influence on new technology, and also their sort of CEOs as these demagogue figures. Obviously, you mentioned Zuckerberg, and also sort of someone like Jeff Bezos, who's the richest man of all time. I just wanted to get your opinions on these four companies in particular and how they shape our future, and if there are any sort of historical comparisons to the influence these private companies have. Thanks.
Well, Scott Galloway has become very critical. He's a New York University professor who writes a lot on technology issues, but he's become extremely critical of these so-called Four Horsemen and has argued in a recent article in Esquire magazine that they should be broken up, that there is essentially a problem of monopoly now in technology. Facebook monopolizes social media, and Apple has a kind of monopoly, at least in areas such as music. Google has a monopoly on search, and Amazon has a monopoly on online retail. That's roughly the argument, and he's now come around to the view that can only be addressed with antitrust. They need to be broken up in the way that Standard Oil was broken up long ago. So I share his concern, because I think there are clear problems of monopoly, but these are natural monopolies. Network economies produce winner-takes-all outcomes, and it's not clear that an antitrust action against Amazon would be successful. In fact, I'm pretty sure that Jeff Bezos would like that action to be brought in order that he could win it, and I think he would win it easily. Certainly
Sorry, on what grounds would he win an
antitrust? Because, Will, the law on antitrust since the 1960s has very clearly said the test is how far the consumer is better or worse off. And there's just no way that you're going to be able to show that the consumer is worse off because of Amazon. It's clear that the consumer is better off in a whole range of ways. The only way that you could bring an antitrust action successfully would be, and it would need, I think, to happen at the Supreme Court level, if there were a radical change in the legal definition of monopoly in the United States. In Europe, of course, there's different legal tradition, and I think there will be more aggressive legal pressure on the big companies in Europe. But I think it's probably a doomed venture to try to do antitrust. I think the issue really is whether there's a level playing field in terms of regulation. And there's not, because in fact, at least 3 of these companies, I don't think it's true of Apple, but at least 3 of these companies enjoy a tremendous advantage over their terrestrial, non-internet competitors. And that is that they are not treated as content publishers. This is especially important for Google and Facebook. They are not treated as content publishers in the way that your friend Rupert Murdoch is. They are treated as technology platforms. And under an obscure piece of legislation from the mid-1990s, the Communications and Decency Act, Title 230, they are not liable for any of the content that appears on their platforms. And that lack of any liability is a huge advantage to Facebook. Facebook is now the biggest publisher in practice of content in the world, and it is now the source of 45% of Americans' news. And yet it's not treated as a content publisher, it's treated as a network platform. That's the anomaly. So I think Scott Galloway is half right. He's right that there's a problem, but I think he's wrong to think that it's going to be solved with antitrust.
Does that not mirror in a way? I mean, you're a eminent scholar also of financial history. Do you not see some kind of congruences between transnational capital flows and the impossibility of implementing antitrust law against the FANG companies? I mean, I'm not saying at a direct causal level, but at a level of congruence, you know, in a sense. And it also relates to this concept you bring up in The Square and the Tower of the administrative state. You know, that in a sense all states can do now is to throw out cheese-pairing regulation, but they can't actually stop these big companies moving their capital very rapidly away. You know, if there were any real attempt to clamp down on them, they could evade it. And also that they could destabilize currencies, fiat currencies in the process.
I don't know about that. I think that we shouldn't exaggerate the power of any corporation relative to the state. The administrative state may be pretty dysfunctional, but as we saw with for example, with the tax bill, you can pretty easily pull the levers of the US Treasury and the US Justice Department and change the way that those companies manage their assets. So I don't know that we've reached that dystopian situation in which the corporations are more powerful than the state. They're very powerful, but ultimately the state is more powerful if it wants to exert its power. And also, it's very difficult indeed for me to imagine Facebook, Google, or Amazon, or for that matter, Apple, relocating from the United States. These are American corporations as much as General Motors was an American corporation. And I predict that as they fight what will be an increasingly tough fight in Washington over regulation, they will become more, not less American. They'll become less cosmopolitan and global. Their ultimate argument, I would predict, is you can't do too much bad stuff to us because we have to compete with them, meaning Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent. And the BAT companies, the Chinese companies, are now almost the equals of the big American technology companies. There are no European players in this game. It is a two-player game, US-China. And the internet is now essentially two worlds, the American and the Chinese. And the question, which will be resolved, I think, in the coming decade, is who's going to control the rest of the world? Because we thought it was going to be the US companies. And it kind of is at this point, but the Chinese companies are making a huge push to expand, especially in emerging markets, and it's going very well. So I think we'll see an increasingly national argument. Increasingly, Apple and others will say, we're American companies, we need to work with you. At this point, we have a conflict between Silicon Valley and Washington. It's getting ugly. I think it will ultimately resolve itself when the technology companies realize that they really need friends in Washington, even if they're Republicans.
Here. Yeah. Hello, I was waiting. Hello.
There.
Hello, I was waiting for. Hello. Sorry. Me. Hey.
I see you now.
Yeah. Been waiting for a while. A personal question. How often do you think about counterfactual Niall Ferguson? And secondly, how can we learn from history if history is one damn thing after another?
Well, I constantly think about counterfactuals in my own life. And I see each day as just a succession of dilemmas of varying magnitudes. It's clear that I could be in a completely different place tonight if I had not had the luck of going to a good school, Glasgow Academy, getting into a good university, Oxford. If the luck had gone the other way, and I hadn't got into Oxford, I'd probably not be sitting here, and neither would he. So I'm deeply conscious of contingency in my own life. I mean, the luck goes further back. The luck of good parents. I know, I can tell. But I think it's important to live with a sense of one's luck and be aware that it could turn at any point. I'm haunted by the question, what terrible thing is about to happen to me that I failed to think about, that I didn't plan for. So that's probably the answer to the more autobiographical part of your question. And I've forgotten the second part because I'm a bit hungry.
Well, you kind of answer it in the Square and the Tower. The gentleman was saying, well, if history's just one damn thing after another, how can we learn from it? But you do address that.
Alan Bennett uses
albeit
that.
Imperfectly.
Yeah, he revived that in the History Boys. It was one fucking thing after another in Bennett's framing. Well, I think the answer is that it's not that. That history is not some kind of weird timeline of events big and small, though it's often represented that way on wall charts. I prefer to think of the historical process as this complex system, or indeed a space filled with multiple complex systems, which we can't fully understand because they don't work like with linear relationships. They're not at all predictable. And so what we can learn from history is only really by rough analogies. So the way I tend to think is that when you're confronted with a problem, whether it's personal or historical, you should ask the question, what is this like? It's not exactly like anything, but what is it roughly like? And if you can't think of a bunch of analogies, you probably don't know enough history. This was how I thought about the approach of the financial crisis 10 years ago. I wrote a book called The Ascent of Money. The Ascent of Money was written in the expectation that a financial crisis was going to happen, and it was right. And the reason I thought it was going to happen was it just looked familiar what was happening in 2006-07. That extraordinary booming economic period that culminated in the crash was recognizable to a financial historian. It was like the previous years before any big crisis. So I tend to think that that's the right way to approach it. Try to find those analogies and then think rigorously about them. And that's really what I do for a living. Most of the time, even when I was writing this column that you didn't like about Angela Merkel's policy, my question was, well, what is this like? What is it like when a really large movement of people occurs? I mean, there are plenty of analogies for that. It's often happened in world history. And we can, I think, compare and learn from the comparisons, and that's how we should proceed. What you can't do is what economists and political scientists have been doing for the last 50 or so years and say, let's imagine a model of how this might work. And let's, from first principles, let's drop a model, and then we'll try and cram the data to fit the model. And that pursuit of models with relatively linear relationships and predictable outputs, I think that will prove to have been almost as futile as medieval theology as an activity.
Anybody else? Yes, young man, can you wait for a microphone? I don't know where the microphone's gone.
I should speak. Hello?
Hello.
Hi. Hi. I'm going to have to be a little bit boring and mention Bitcoin, which we're probably all bored of after the winter that we've just had. It struck me, and your sort of listen to your views on it, Neil, in the media, that if you're not warm towards it, you're at least room temperature towards it, which is quite unique as someone who is, for want of a better word, mainstream commentator. And I guess just going back to your last answer, what is Bitcoin like historically, and what isn't it like as well?
It's not like the Dutch tulip mania of the 17th century, which is what everybody compares it to. Jamie Dimon did that, but he was only one of many. I think Paul Krugman has done it. It's not like that. And that suggests they don't know anything about the Dutch tulip mania. It's more like what happened in the 18th century when, for the first time, equity in corporations was traded. That was a financial innovation without any real precedent. The creation of the South Sea Company and the Mississippi Company in France allowed a huge experiment with, in effect, the first stock markets to happen. And of course, what happened was a bubble in both cases. And I think Bitcoin is that kind of a financial innovation that it's so game-changing in the sense that it really has, at least blockchain is so game-changing. Bitcoin is just one iteration of this experiment. It is so game-changing that it of course attracted a great flood of money. And then, as always happens in a bubble, along come the charlatans with their initial coin offerings to do such things as we shall tell you about later, just give us the money, and the suckers. So that all happened last year, and you could see it in California. I had a ringside seat. People were coming to me with, and they still are, it hasn't stopped, initial coin offering ideas that they wanted me to endorse. And it was like, I would read the white papers and say, but you're just like one of those 18th century speculators. You want the money, but you won't really say why. So a huge number of these things, some of which have been Bitcoin-based, most have been Ethereum-based, will turn out to be scams. But I'm lukewarm in the sense that I think out of this experiment, as in the case of the 18th century equity finance experiment, something will remain. It's not quite clear what the ultimate end use case of blockchain is, but I think there will be one. I don't think blockchain is going to create new currencies that will replace fiat currencies. In that sense, I don't think it's right to think of Bitcoin as a coin, or for that matter, a banknote. I think it's better to think of these things as ways in which smart contracts could be used. I mean, I think that's probably where we go. Blockchain can be used for a whole range of different things. Payments is probably the least efficient of these things. But there are a bunch of different contractual exchanges that could be done through blockchain. Governments, I think, could make their healthcare systems more efficient through blockchain. That's already happening in Estonia. So I think Bitcoin itself will seem like one of these prototypes that 10 years from now we'll think, that was picturesque. It'll be kind of a little bit of a museum piece, in the same way that the South Sea Company wasn't really the future of the British economy, but equity finance survived and became central to finance. And I think blockchain will become pretty central, not just to finance, but possibly to bureaucracy generally in the coming 10 years.
Very annoyingly, I think the hall is about to be invaded by rampaging theists who regard it as their place of worship. So we're going to have to wind up there. I think Niall's going to be around for a while in the foyer and will be signing his magisterial work of history, a noble successor to the works of Macaulay et al. And I'll also be there signing my knockoff modernist shit. Take your pick.